Sometimes the box score tells one story, and the game itself tells another. And that's exactly why the conversation around Shedeur Sanders after the Buffalo game has exploded the way it has. On paper, the numbers weren't loud. No gaudy yardage, no highlight reel stat line, just efficiency, control, and a narrow 23-20 loss against one of the hottest teams in the league. Yet somehow, that performance sparked one of the loudest debates of the week. Not because of what fans said, but because of who stepped in to defend it. Skip Bayless didn't hedge, he didn't qualify, he went straight to the point. What he saw wasn't just a rookie holding his own, he saw a future franchise quarterback. Tough, composed, unfazed by pressure, and willing to play through pain to keep his team in the game. That alone raised eyebrows. Because Skip isn't known for handing out praise lightly, especially when the stat sheet doesn't scream dominance. So when he doubled down, pointing to long, methodical drives, third down control, and command against a veteran Buffalo defense, the conversation shifted. This wasn't about fantasy points anymore. It was about evaluation. And that's where the divide begins. Some fans saw missed opportunities and interceptions. Others saw a young quarterback managing chaos, operating an offense, and keeping his team competitive despite injuries and pressure. Two sides watching the same game and walking away with completely different conclusions. Which raises a bigger question. Are we judging Shedeur Sanders by the right standards, or just the loudest ones? Because once you dig into what actually happened on that field and compare how other quarterbacks are being treated, the criticism starts to feel less about performance and more about perception. And that's where this story really gets interesting. When Skip Bayless speaks, the reaction is usually split down the middle. Some lean in, others roll their eyes, but either way, people listen. That's why his response to Shedeur Sanders' performance against Buffalo hit differently. This wasn't one of those half-hearted takes meant to stir debate. Skip went all in, and that's what changed the tone of the conversation. He didn't start with excuses. He didn't hide behind context. He started with conviction. According to Skip, what he saw on that field wasn't just a rookie surviving. It was a quarterback commanding an offense against a disciplined, experienced defense. A defense that thrives on pressure, confusion, and mistakes. And yet, Shedeur didn't unravel. Skip focused on something most critics skipped right past: control, long drives, sustained possessions, third down efficiency. Those aren't flashy highlights, but they're the backbone of NFL quarterbacking, especially against a team like the Buffalo Bills, who punish impatience and feast on reckless throws. Then came the moment that defined Skip's stance: toughness. Shedeur briefly left the game after injuring his finger. Many quarterbacks would have stayed out. Some would have played differently after coming back. But Skip emphasized what happened next. Shedeur returned, didn't flinch, and kept running the offense. No visible panic, no hesitation, just execution. To Skip, that wasn't accidental, it was a trait. He even reached back into history, reminding viewers that rookie quarterbacks aren't supposed to look perfect. Mistakes are part of the process. Timing takes time. The speed of the league doesn't slow down for anyone. What matters is whether a quarterback shrinks or steadies himself. And in Skip's eyes, Shedeur did the latter. That's what made this endorsement so polarizing. Because Skip wasn't praising upside, he was praising readiness. Not potential, but presence. And when a veteran analyst says a young quarterback is making teams look foolish for overlooking him, it forces people to reevaluate what they think they saw. You don't have to agree with Skip, but you can't ignore the question he raised. If this wasn't a bad performance, why is it being treated like one? And once that question is asked, the focus naturally shifts to what the stat sheet didn't explain and why some fans are still unconvinced. What made Skip's take stand out wasn't hype, it was specificity. He wasn't praising vibes or selling a storyline. He broke down why the performance mattered, even if the stat line didn't jump off the screen. And once you slow the game down, his point becomes harder to dismiss. Start with context. The Buffalo Bills weren't just rolling into Cleveland on reputation. They were hot, confident, and led by a defense that thrives on experience and opportunism. That's the kind of unit that preys on young quarterbacks, baiting throws, disguising coverages, waiting for panic. But Skip noticed something unusual. Shedeur didn't give them that moment. Instead of chasing big plays, Shedeur Sanders kept the offense on schedule. Short completions, smart decisions, drives that didn't collapse after one mistake. Skip pointed directly to those long possessions, 8 plays, 13 plays, 14 plays, all ending in points. That's not accident, that's command. Then there was third down, 8 conversions out of 14, against Buffalo. That stat alone tells a story. Third down is where defenses show their teeth, where mistakes get punished, where rookies usually struggle the most. But Shedeur kept finding answers, even when the protection wasn't perfect and the margin for error was thin. Skip also zeroed in on composure under stress, not just pressure from the defense but physical stress. After injuring his finger and briefly leaving the game, Shedeur came back and picked up right where he left off. No visible hesitation, no altered mechanics. For Skip, that wasn't toughness for show. It was toughness you build habits around. And yes, the interceptions came up. Skip didn't dodge them. He called them avoidable, teachable, part of the learning curve. One tipped, one late. But what mattered to him was what didn't follow. There was no unraveling, no forced throws, no spiral. Shedeur stayed steady. That's the part critics often miss. Because quarterbacks don't earn trust by being flawless. They earn it by responding. And what Skip saw wasn't a rookie trying to survive a game, it was a quarterback managing one. That's why his conclusion landed so strongly. Not because Shedeur dominated Buffalo, but because he controlled himself against them. And once you understand that, the criticism starts to feel less about performance and more about expectations people never agreed on in the first place. This is where the conversation usually derails. 2 interceptions show up on the stat sheet, and suddenly everything else gets ignored. For some fans, that's the end of the discussion. But this is exactly the part Skip Bayless pushed back on, because not all interceptions tell the same story. The first one is the easiest to overreact to and the easiest to misunderstand. It wasn't a reckless heave. It wasn't a misread of coverage. It was a timing throw that arrived slightly behind the target and got tipped into the air. That matters, because tipped passes aren't quarterback killers, they're chemistry moments. The kind that get corrected with reps, not criticism. The second interception wasn't defended either. Skip called it avoidable, a learning moment. But he also framed it honestly. This is what happens when a young quarterback is adjusting to NFL speed against a defense designed to disguise intent. Windows close faster, safeties bait throws, and rookies learn those lessons the hard way. That's where perspective comes in. Skip reminded viewers that some of the greatest quarterbacks in league history struggled with interceptions early. He pointed out that learning when not to throw is often harder than learning how to throw. That doesn't excuse mistakes, but it explains them, and it reframes the expectation from perfection to progress. What made these interceptions different from the usual rookie mistakes was what followed. There was no panic, no forced hero ball, no attempt to get it all back on the next snap. Shedeur Sanders stayed within the offense. He didn't let one mistake turn into 3. That restraint is rare in young quarterbacks, especially ones under constant pressure. Critics often say he holds the ball too long, but that criticism skips context. Holding the ball is sometimes hesitation and sometimes patience. Against Buffalo, it looked more like the latter, waiting for roots to develop, avoiding unnecessary risks, trusting the system even when it wasn't perfect. This is where the debate becomes philosophical. Do you want a rookie who plays safe and learns from mistakes, or one who chases highlights and creates chaos? Skip's stance was clear. He'd rather take the interceptions that come from aggression within structure than celebrate empty yards that don't translate to control. Because the goal isn't to win the stat sheet. It's to build habits that win games later. And once you view the interceptions through that lens, the outrage starts to feel misplaced. Which leads directly to the next controversy: why other quarterbacks making far worse mistakes don't seem to face the same heat. This is where frustration turns into accusation, not against one quarterback, but against the way quarterbacks are judged. Because once fans started lining up performances across the league, one comparison kept surfacing: Jaxson Dart. On the same weekend that Shedeur Sanders was being dissected for every mistake, Dart turned in a first-half performance that struggled badly. Minimal yardage, constant pressure, multiple sacks, an interception, an offense that barely moved the ball. And yet, the reaction around that performance was noticeably softer. That difference didn't go unnoticed. Fans started asking a simple question: why does one quarterback get context while the other gets condemnation? Dart's struggles were framed as growing pains, learning moments, a rough matchup. Meanwhile, Shedeur's mistakes were treated like red flags, proof that the Browns should already be looking elsewhere. The numbers alone don't justify that split. In fact, if you stack the two performances side by side, the contrast is striking. Shedeur sustained drives, converted third downs, kept his team competitive against a stronger opponent. Dart's offense stalled early and often, yet the tone surrounding each quarterback couldn't have been more different. This is where the double standard argument takes hold. Some fans believe it comes down to visibility. Shedeur is constantly in the spotlight, every snap analyzed, every quote amplified. With attention comes scrutiny, and the margin for grace shrinks. Others argue it's expectation. Shedeur carries the weight of being the story, while Dart operates outside that pressure bubble. There's also the uncomfortable factor nobody likes to say out loud: narrative stick. Once a quarterback is labeled a project, mistakes get patience. Once a quarterback is labeled polarizing, mistakes get magnified. And none of this means Jaxson Dart is a bad quarterback. That's not the argument. The argument is consistency. If rookie struggles are acceptable, they should be acceptable across the board. If development takes time, it should take time for everyone. That's why this comparison keeps coming back. Not because fans want to tear one player down, but because they want fairness in evaluation. They want context to matter equally. They want progress to be recognized, not punished. And once that imbalance is felt, the criticism around Shedeur starts to feel less analytical and more emotional. Because when standards shift depending on the name on the jersey, fans don't just question the take. They question the system producing it. And that opens the door to an even bigger discussion: why Shedeur is being judged so differently in the first place. By now, it's clear the criticism around Shedeur Sanders isn't coming from just one bad throw or one rough series. It's coming from something deeper: the expectations attached to his name, his visibility, and the moment he stepped into. Shedeur doesn't get evaluated quietly. He never has. From the moment he entered the league, his presence carried weight beyond the playbook. That means every decision gets amplified, every mistake gets replayed, and every good moment gets questioned instead of celebrated. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when a player becomes a symbol instead of just a quarterback. Part of it is exposure. Shedeur is talked about more than most rookies. Debate shows lead with him. Social media clips circulate within minutes. When attention follows a player this closely, the tolerance for normal rookie mistakes disappears. The same throw that gets labeled learning curve for one quarterback becomes proof he's not the guy for another. Then there's expectation. Some fans expected immediate greatness. Others expected failure. Very few expected patience. And when a player doesn't neatly fit into either extreme, the reaction becomes confusion. and confusion often turns into criticism. Another layer is perception. Shedeur's calm gets mistaken for holding the ball too long. His confidence gets framed as stubbornness. His toughness gets overlooked because it doesn't look dramatic. These aren't football evaluations, they're narrative shortcuts. This is where the conversation drifts away from film and into feeling. Because if you slow the tape down, you see a quarterback navigating pressure, avoiding panic, and choosing structure over chaos. You see someone trying to run the offense as designed, even when protection breaks down or routes take time to develop. That's not recklessness, that's discipline. But discipline doesn't always look exciting, and it rarely wins highlight arguments. And that's the core issue. Shedeur isn't being judged only on what he does. He's being judged on what people expected him to do. And when expectations are inflated or polarized, no performance ever fully satisfies them. That's why the criticism feels louder than the mistakes. It's not about interceptions. It's not about yardage. It's about whether people are willing to let a young quarterback grow without forcing a verdict too early. Because once a narrative hardens, it stops responding to evidence. And right now, Shedeur Sanders isn't fighting defenses alone. He's fighting perception. Which brings us to the final question. What actually defines a franchise quarterback in today's NFL? This is where the argument finally zooms out, away from one game, one stat line, or one debate segment, and into something the NFL still struggles to define clearly. What actually makes a franchise quarterback? Because if it were just about numbers, the answer would be easy. Yards, touchdowns, ratings. But history shows that those stats don't always tell you who lasts or who leads. Some quarterbacks pile up numbers and fade. Others grow quietly, then take over the league once everything clicks. That's why evaluators look deeper. A franchise quarterback is measured by command, not just calling plays but controlling moments. 3rd and long, 2-minute drills, back-to-back mistakes. Those are the snaps that reveal whether a quarterback panics or processes. Against Buffalo, Shedeur Sanders didn't dominate, but he didn't disappear either. And that distinction matters. Then there's resilience. Getting hit, getting criticized, getting doubted. The league doesn't wait for confidence to form, it tests it immediately. Franchise quarterbacks don't avoid pressure, they absorb it and stay functional. Not flashy, functional. That's how trust gets built in locker rooms. Decision-making is another piece people oversimplify. Playing it safe isn't weakness. It's often a sign of understanding situation over ego, knowing when to take a check down, knowing when to live for the next drive. Those habits don't trend on social media, but coaches value them deeply. And finally, there's presence. You can feel it when a quarterback has it. Teammates respond differently. Drives feel calmer. Even losses feel competitive instead of chaotic. That's not something you see in highlights, it's something you sense over time. This is where the disconnect with public debate becomes obvious. Fans want instant answers. Analysts want clean labels, but quarterbacks are built in phases. Early survival, then control, then command. Judging someone too early often says more about impatience than performance. Shedeur's situation forces this question because he sits right in that uncomfortable middle phase. Not raw, not finished, showing traits that matter while still learning the edges of the game. And that's why this moment is so polarizing. Some people want proof now. Others recognize the process. The NFL has seen both paths play out before. The only mistake is pretending there's just one way to recognize a franchise quarterback, when history says it usually reveals itself slowly. Which leads to the final thought that hangs over this entire conversation. What's happening around Shedeur Sanders right now isn't just a football argument, it's a mirror. A reflection of how quickly opinions form, how uneven standards can be, and how uncomfortable patience has become in the modern NFL. One group looks at the box score and sees flaws. Another looks at the game itself and sees foundation. Both are watching the same snaps, but they're asking different questions. One side wants instant confirmation. The other wants trajectory. And that gap is where the noise lives. What made this moment explode wasn't just Shedeur's performance against Buffalo. It was Skip Bayless stepping in and saying, out loud, what many evaluators quietly think. That quarterbacking isn't always loud. That command doesn't always come with fireworks. And that toughness, poise, and control matter just as much as raw output. The backlash to that take says more about the audience than the player. Because if 2 interceptions erase long drives, third down efficiency, and composure under pressure, then the standard isn't development, it's perfection. And perfection has never been the entry requirement for franchise quarterbacks. Growth has. The comparison debates, the double standards, the constant shifting of expectations, all of it points to the same truth. Shedeur isn't being evaluated in a vacuum. He's being evaluated in a spotlight. And spotlights don't magnify just talent, they magnify opinion. That's why this discussion won't end next week or next month. As long as Shedeur is starting games, people will argue about what they think he should be versus what he's actually becoming. And that tension will only grow louder as expectations rise. The real answer won't come from talk shows or timelines. It'll come over time in how he adjusts, how the offense evolves, and how the league responds once the noise settles. Because eventually, hype fades, criticism moves on, and what's left is substance. Right now, Shedeur Sanders is still writing that story. And whether people believe in it or doubt it, one thing is already clear. This isn't a fluke conversation. It's the beginning of a long one.